Ethan Carter, a 45-year-old millionaire, woke up in a hospital bed, disoriented by the dim light filling the room. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and the bitter taste of anesthesia lingered in his mouth. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he blinked several times, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The white ceiling came into focus, then the beeping monitors beside him. That's when he noticed Emily, his wife of 15 years, sitting in a chair next to his bed. Her face was pale, eyes red and swollen from crying. Strands of her dark hair had fallen loose from her usually neat ponytail. She hadn't noticed he was awake yet, her gaze fixed on her trembling hands. Confused and worried, Ethan tried to speak, but his voice came out as little more than a rasp. "What's wrong, love?" The words scraped against his dry throat. He reached out, attempting to take her hand in his, but she pulled away slightly, as if his touch might burn her. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Then, between quiet sobs that shook her slender shoulders, Emily whispered something that made Ethan's heart stop beating for a moment. The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. "I had already signed the divorce papers." Shock coursed through Ethan's body, more intense than any physical pain he was experiencing. "What?" He tried to sit up, but a sharp stab in his chest forced him back down against the stiff hospital pillows. His mind raced, trying to process what she had just said. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still avoiding his gaze. "I never wanted you to find out this way. But now, after the accident, everything feels different." Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile like glass. Ethan struggled to remember what had happened, but his mind was foggy, filled with holes where memories should be. Fragments of the accident flashed through his consciousness: screeching tires, the violent impact, glass shattering around him. But nothing made sense. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling, betraying the emotions swirling inside him. He felt like he was falling, with nothing to grab onto. Emily finally looked up, her blue eyes meeting his, but quickly returned to staring at her hands. Her wedding ring still gleamed on her finger, a painful reminder of what they once had. "Because I felt invisible by your side, like I didn't matter anymore." The truth hung between them, filling the room with the weight of words never spoken, opportunities missed, and a relationship that had slowly crumbled while neither was watching. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to force his brain to remember what had brought him here. Scattered images appeared. He was driving home late from work, rain pelting against the windshield, his phone ringing. Had he answered it? He couldn't recall. There was the sound of tires skidding, the sickening crunch of metal, and then darkness. The memories were like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. He opened his eyes again, finding Emily still there, watching him with an unreadable expression. "How long have I been here?" he asked, noticing the stubble on his chin for the first time. Emily sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. 2 days. The doctors weren't sure if... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan glanced at her left hand, the gold band still on her finger catching the fluorescent light. Something tight formed in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. "If you'd already signed the divorce papers, why are you here?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Because when I got the call about the accident, I realized that despite everything, I still care." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I couldn't just not come." In that moment, Ethan understood this might be his last chance to figure out what went wrong, and perhaps salvage what little remained of their life together. The tension between them filled the small hospital room, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Emily wiped away her tears with the sleeve of her cardigan and looked toward the window where raindrops raced down the glass. Ethan fought against both physical pain and the emotional turmoil swirling inside him. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he murmured, his voice low and rough. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Emily turned back to him, her eyes reflecting years of disappointment. "But I did. Ethan, you ignored me. Your work, your meetings, your money, everything came before me, before us." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture he'd always found endearing. "Do you know how many dinners I ate alone? How many times I fell asleep waiting for you to come home?" Her words cut deeper than any injury from the accident. Ethan tried to formulate a defense, but the excuses died on his lips. For the first time, he truly saw the hurt he'd caused. "What if I could change that?" he asked softly. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're only saying that because you almost died." She stood up and walked to the window, arms crossed protectively over her chest. But something had shifted in Ethan. Through the fog of pain medication and regret, he realized he was actually listening to her, perhaps for the first time in years. The door opened, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand, interrupting their conversation. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "Mr. Carter, your recovery will be slow, but we expect you'll return to normal eventually. The impact could have been much worse." The doctor reviewed some notes before continuing. "We'll need to monitor you for a few more days." Ethan merely nodded, his mind still focused on Emily, who had stepped back to make room for the doctor. When the doctor left, promising to return later, Ethan reached for Emily's hand. This time she didn't pull away. "Tell me the truth," he said, his fingers gently holding hers. "Do you still love me?" Emily's hesitation felt like an eternity. She looked down at their intertwined fingers. I don't know anymore. Part of me is angry with you. Another part misses who we used to be." She bit her lower lip. "Sometimes I look at you and still see the man I fell in love with. But then I remember all the nights I spent alone." Ethan swallowed hard, fear gripping his heart. "And if I had died? What would you have felt then?" Emily flinched as if his question had physically struck her. She wrapped her free arm around herself. "I would have regretted not trying harder to make us work." Her voice was barely audible, but in it, Ethan heard a tiny sliver of hope between them for the first time. In the days that followed, Emily continued to visit Ethan, bringing him books and fresh clothes, though she maintained an emotional distance that was palpable. The hospital room became a strange middle ground, where they existed together yet apart. Ethan treasured each visit, using every conversation as an opportunity to understand where things had gone wrong. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the blinds creating patterns on the white hospital sheets, Ethan watched Emily arrange flowers a colleague had sent. Her movements were careful, deliberate, just like they'd always been. "Remember our honeymoon in Italy?" he asked suddenly. "That little restaurant in Florence where the owner kept bringing us free wine?" Emily's hands paused. A small, sad smile crossed her lips. "You promised me that night that you'd always make time for us." She adjusted a lily in the vase. "You said work would never come before me." Ethan swallowed hard, the memory bittersweet. "And I broke that promise." The admission hung in the air between them. Emily nodded, not with anger, but with a weariness that spoke of years of disappointment. She sat in the chair beside his bed, close but not touching him. Looking at her profile in the afternoon light, Ethan realized that winning back his wife would be harder than any business deal he'd ever negotiated, but the idea of losing her permanently was unbearable. If he got a second chance, he silently vowed he wouldn't waste it. When the doctor finally discharged Ethan a week later, he insisted that Emily drive him home. She agreed reluctantly, helping him into her modest sedan while avoiding unnecessary contact. The drive was quiet, with only the radio playing softly in the background. Ethan watched the familiar city streets pass by, feeling like a stranger returning to a place he once knew. "I've been thinking," Emily said finally, breaking the silence as they waited at a red light. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were." She glanced at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. Ethan turned toward her, wincing slightly from the pain in his ribs. "Then let's build something new." His voice was steady, determined. Emily laughed, a short, surprised sound that wasn't entirely dismissive. There was something different in it, perhaps a glimmer of what could be. "You've always been good with words, Ethan." He smiled despite the discomfort. "Now I want to be good with actions." The light turned green, and Emily pressed the accelerator. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't immediately shut him down or turn away. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but maybe a small crack had formed. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still something worth saving in the wreckage of their marriage. As they pulled into the driveway of their large suburban home, Ethan felt both relief and apprehension. What would happen next? Their house, a spacious modern home with large windows and minimalist furniture, felt both familiar and strangely alien to Ethan as Emily helped him inside. Everything was exactly where it had always been, yet something felt different. Perhaps it was him who had changed. Emily hovered in the entryway, car keys still in hand, clearly uncomfortable. "I think I should go to the hotel now," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "You're home safe, and I've already arranged for a nurse to check on you tomorrow." But Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand before she could leave. "Stay, just for tonight." His eyes met hers, pleading without words. "Please." Emily took a deep breath, her internal struggle visible on her face. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Just for tonight." During dinner, takeout from their favorite Italian place that Emily had picked up, they talked more than they had in the past several years. Conversation started hesitantly, with safe topics like the weather and neighborhood news, but gradually evolved into something more meaningful. Ethan noticed the shy laughter that occasionally escaped her lips, the way her eyes lingered on his, a moment longer than necessary. Something was shifting between them, subtle but undeniable. When Emily stood to clear the dishes, Ethan surprised her with words that came from somewhere deep inside him. "Thank you for still being here." She didn't respond immediately, but before heading to the guest bedroom, she turned and offered him a soft smile that warmed him more than any blanket could. Days passed, and Emily continued to stay in the house, though she maintained her distance emotionally and physically. She helped Ethan with his medication, made sure he ate properly, and drove him to follow-up appointments. But there was always an invisible barrier between them. Each night, she retreated to the guest bedroom without discussion. One evening, as they sat on the patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily broke their comfortable silence. "This doesn't mean we're back together," she said quietly, tucking her legs beneath her on the outdoor sofa. She wore Ethan's old university sweatshirt, something she'd always done when she wanted comfort. Ethan nodded, watching a pair of birds chase each other across the darkening sky. "I know, but it means we still have something worth exploring." He turned to look at her, careful not to push too hard. Emily didn't contradict him. For the first time, she seemed to acknowledge that Ethan was genuinely trying to change, the way he listened when she spoke, how he'd stopped checking his phone constantly, the small gestures of appreciation he showed her, all signs that something was different. Yet fear held her back. The fear of being hurt again, of giving her heart only to have it overlooked and undervalued. Ethan could see the hesitation in her eyes, and he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to prove to her once and for all that he was committed to change, not with his wealth, but with his heart. Ethan spent days planning, making phone calls when Emily was out running errands. His body was healing slowly, but his determination grew stronger with each passing day. He arranged for a special dinner at home. Nothing extravagant or showy, just the two of them. He cooked himself, despite the pain that shot through his ribs when he reached for ingredients on high shelves. When Emily arrived home that evening, she found the dining room softly lit with candles, her favorite pasta dish steaming on the table. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "What's all this?" Ethan pulled out her chair. "I know words aren't enough, so I want to show you something." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a box he'd placed under the table. From it, he produced an old leather-bound album that Emily hadn't seen in years. As she opened it, her breath caught. Inside were photos from their early days together, handwritten notes she'd left in his lunch, ticket stubs from concerts they'd attended, small details of their life together that she thought he had forgotten or never noticed. Emily turned the pages slowly, emotion evident on her face. "I had no idea you kept all this," she whispered, touching a pressed flower from their first date. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "I always kept them. I was just stupid enough not to show you how much they meant to me." He squeezed her fingers gently. "How much you meant to me." Emily felt her heart quicken. Perhaps, just maybe, there was still hope for them after all. Emily allowed herself to feel, truly feel, for the first time in months. The walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble as she flipped through the album, memories flooding back with each page. Watching Ethan across the table, she realized that despite the pain, the arguments, the loneliness, the love had never completely died. It had been buried, neglected, but not extinguished. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. The sound created a cocoon around them, as if they were the only two people in the world. Emily closed the album and looked up at Ethan. Really, I looked at him. The lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met. The gray at his temples. The sincerity in his gaze. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect," Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible above the rainfall. "I'll still make mistakes. But I can promise that I will never again make you feel invisible." He reached for her hand again, his touch gentle. "You are the most important part of my life, not an afterthought." Emily's mind wrestled with her heart. Years of disappointment warred against the hope blooming inside her. The practical side of her listed all the reasons to walk away, while another part remembered the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who seemed to be sitting across from her now. Finally, she let out a deep sigh, as if releasing years of pent-up hurt. "Let's try," she whispered, two simple words that changed everything. Ethan's smile was a mixture of relief and joy, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. Months passed, and gradually they relearned how to be a couple. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, moments of doubt when old patterns threatened to resurface, nights when the past loomed large between them. But there were also movie nights curled up on the couch, impromptu dance sessions, in the kitchen, and quiet moments of understanding that needed no words. Ethan made good on his promise. He reduced his working hours, delegated more responsibilities at his company, and made Emily a priority, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with time and attention, the things she had always craved. Emily moved her things back from the guest room into their shared bedroom. The divorce papers remained unsigned, tucked away in a drawer, and eventually forgotten. On their anniversary, 6 months after the accident, Ethan surprised Emily with a weekend trip to the mountains, to a small cabin where they could hike during the day and sit by the fire at night. They talked about the future for the first time in years, not with the uncertainty that had clouded their recent past, but with hope and plans. One afternoon, as they walked along a forest trail, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, Emily's fingers found Ethan's, intertwining naturally. "I think we made the right choice," she said, her breath visible in the cool air. Ethan squeezed her hand, the gold of their wedding bands catching the sunlight filtering through the trees. This time around, I won't mess it up. And for the first time in a long time, they both believed it. Not because the path ahead would be perfect or without challenges, but because they had chosen to walk it together.